Probably clicked on this video because you're an Aussie that's just gotten a job in the US, or you're trying to learn more about the possibility of working in the US. There is a lot of information out there, but wading through the government websites and the massive blocks of information can be exhausting. But don't worry, the E-3 visa is fairly straightforward. I moved to New York from Sydney and I've gone through the E-3 visa process twice now. So I wanted to make a video to explain the process behind getting an E-3 visa and hopefully give you an insight as to what to expect. I do want to preface that in this video I'll be discussing the visa very generally, and this is in no way legal advice. I actually had immigration lawyers assist me for both of my applications, so it definitely is something I would recommend you do too, and most of the time employers often are happy to help with this. So what actually is an E-3 visa? It was introduced in 2005 and it's specifically for Australian professionals to work in the United States. It also allows for spouses of E-3 holders to have work rights in the US, but this is an additional application. In total, they make available 10,500 spots for the E3 each year, and to my understanding, this cap hasn't been hit yet. So what are the eligibility requirements? Very simply, you have to be an Australian citizen, you must have a job offer from a US employer, and you must be filling a position that qualifies as a specialty occupation. And the way I understand this is that the job that you're taking must require at least a bachelor's degree. And of course, you must possess the relevant qualification. And on top of that, you must have the intent to return to Australia and that your stay in the US is temporary. So once you've got your offer and you want to kickstart the visa process, there are three key things you need to get done. You need to get an LCA, you need to get a DS-160, and then you need to do your interview. I know that this all sounds like a whole load of gibberish right now, but let me explain. So the LCA stands for Labour Condition Application, and the LCA essentially sets out the details of the employment. So it includes the details of the employer, your start date, how long you'll be employed, your salary, your position title, etc. And this application needs to be filed by your employer. And once that's done, they'll pass along an LCA number, which you need to include on your DS-160 application. So the DS-160 application is a non-immigrant visa application. Non-immigrant meaning that you aren't intending to immigrate to the US. You're just temporarily working in the US for a set period of time. And this is an application that you need to fill out. And when you're preparing this application, one of the first steps is to select a location for your interview. We'll just skip over this right now, but I'll touch on this later. The DS-160 to me was pretty much like a background check or like a background declaration, and you have to input quite a bit of information about yourself, your family, your work history, and your travel history. They even ask you very specific questions such as what periods have you visited the US before, and naming all the countries that you've visited in the last 5 years. So you do want to make sure that you have clear records of these things. The application is pretty lengthy and you want to make sure everything you put in there is accurate, so definitely take your time to do this properly. Once the DS-160 is complete, you can book in your appointment. You have to do the visa interview at a US consulate or embassy. It can be in Australia, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And this is where things can get a little bit dicey. So like I said before, you have to select the location before you start the DS-160 application. And you won't have any way of seeing what appointments are available in different locations without going through the whole process of completing a DS-160 and paying the application fee. Once you pay the fee, you get to see the appointments available for that specific location that you initially selected. But while you can change the appointment time once you locked it in initially, it's not easy to change the location and you can't see appointments at other locations. I ran into this problem with my first E-3 visa. I initially selected Sydney because that's where I lived, and at the time, the earliest appointment I could get was 6 months away. So I just booked it in and I would check every single day to see if I could nab an earlier appointment. After looking for a couple of weeks, I managed to change my appointment twice, shifting it about 6 weeks earlier. But because of this delay, I couldn't give notice into my current employer, and I was also concerned that my US employer might not be willing to wait that long for me to get my visa and to actually start working. I had heard from a friend that they had another friend that had just gone to Singapore and their visa turnaround was quite quick. But like I said, because I had applied for Sydney, there was nowhere for me to check the availabilities in Singapore. I ended up calling the US consulate in Singapore and they were actually very, very helpful. They said that I couldn't see it on my side of things because I was locked into Sydney as a location, but they read out to me the potential availabilities if I was to book, then and there. And because the availabilities were within a couple weeks, I decided just to change it right there, and they just did it with me over the phone, and they changed my application location to Singapore and I had to, sort of repopulate my DS160 and just confirm a few things, but I had to repay the fee. So I think it is very important for you to have that foresight and to really be thinking about where you're gonna do this visa interview before you just dive into the application process. On the US Department of State website, there is a page that shows E3 visa wait times, but they don't provide any specific availabilities. They just have an estimate window. It might say 25 days, or it might say 250 days. If you are using an immigration lawyer, they might have some additional context because they're working with clients that are also doing interviews, so they definitely have a better idea of which consulates have available appointments. So I'll definitely ask them. Another great resource that I've used is the Facebook page Aussies in New York, where tons of people have posted about their own visa experiences, and some people even helpfully share screenshots of the availabilities for whichever city or location that they have currently booked in for. So you can look at this without having to pay the application fee. Also, the application fee as of August 2023 is $315 US. And what's good about the visa is that this is actually the only administrative fee that you need to pay. But be warned, payment methods may vary depending on the location that you're doing your interview. So, after you get through filling out all those applications and finally booking in your interview, it's time to actually prepare and do your interview. The documents that you need to bring are, of course, your Aussie passport, your formal offer from your employer, a copy of the LCA, your DS160 confirmation, the receipt of your application fee, a visa photo, documents supporting your relevant qualifications, and documents that support your ties back to Australia. And this can be bank accounts, superannuation accounts, or home ownership, or anything like that. I did my visa interviews in Singapore the first time, and then Sao Paulo, Brazil the second time. And for both, when I rocked up to the consulate, there were a ton of people there, which sort of freaked me out because I just sort of rocked up 10 minutes before my allocated time, and now I thought I was going to be here for hours. But if you go at your allocated time and you just see the person at the front, they just let you right in. You can't bring your phone into any of the consulates. In Singapore, they were really helpful. As you went through security, they put your phone away for you and gave you a tag. While in Sao Paulo, they didn't really have a system like that, and I had to put my phone in a locker at a nearby convenience store. There is quite a bit of waiting around once you get inside, and of course you don't have your phone or anything to kill time, so there's just a lot of looking around. But once it gets to you, you hand over your passport and your LCA and the interview begins. And in my experience, the interview was just a few simple questions. They asked me about the position title and the company that I was going to be working for. They asked me what city I would be living in, and they asked me if I had any family in the States. And that's it. All my interviews were very short and very straightforward. I brought all that documentation I mentioned before, but they didn't ask to see any of that additional stuff. They just needed my passport and my LCA. And I was approved on the spot. But I definitely would have those documents ready, and be prepared to talk more about your work experience and how it's relevant to the role, as well as being able to describe your ties back to Australia, and making sure that if they ask, that you can make it clear that your stay in the US is temporary and that you do intend to eventually move back to Australia. Once your visa is approved, they take your passport and you wait for a confirmation email. And of course, this is the most nerve-wracking part. You don't have your passport, you're in a foreign country. It definitely does feel a little bit spooky. But for me, both times my passport was ready within 48 hours. Although I've heard of situations where people have had to wait a few weeks to get their passport back. And if you're traveling to do the interview, this can really be an absolute pain. It's just extra money, you've got to pay for accommodation. And of course, if you have a return flight and you have to change or cancel that, that's just an additional cost. So if you do have a chance in the interview to slip in that you have a return flight and you tell them what date, from my experience, when I told them about my return flights, they expedited my application, and I think they're generally very understanding of this situation. But once you get your passport back, you're ready for the big move. But it is important to remember that you can only enter the US 10 days before the official start date, which is listed on your LCA. The E3 visa expires on the date that it says on your LCA, with a maximum of 24 months. I know people that have been here on E3s for 10 plus years. They just keep renewing it and there's no problem. My first E3 experience was stressful, to say the least. Only able to get an interview 6 months out, thinking that the employer was just gonna back out of it, and then changing the appointment and having to travel to a completely different country just to do an interview in which they asked me like 3 questions. So from when I got the offer to when I finally had got the visa, it had already taken over 3 months. The second time round, I definitely knew what I was in for. I was definitely more organized and more strategic about picking a place to do the E3, so I definitely wasn't stressed out at all, and everything went very smoothly. The process from getting an offer and starting the applications to finally getting the visa was about a month total, and I spent 5 days total in Sao Paulo. Hopefully this video has given you a better idea of what to expect throughout your E3 visa process. It's definitely initially daunting, but there are so many fellow Aussies out there that have gone through this process, and there are so many generous people online that have talked about their own experiences, so I know you'll be just fine. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Anyways, hopefully that all made sense. If you want to hear about what it's really like to live overseas, then go ahead and click this video right here. Otherwise, thank you guys again. Bye.